The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Sorry, I've unmuted myself. So if you could just go to the question box and type in the word clear, that would let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. Thank you. Great. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Elsie. Thanks, Francis. Thanks, Kirsty. Thanks, Megan. Excellent. All right, I'm assuming I'm coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Leona. Okay. All right, so we're on to topic 5 today, and we're going to talk about some of the communication skills that are necessary when you're dealing with people in a conflict situation. So I'll be covering that today in our session, and as you know, after this session I'll post up the recording onto the learning platform and the slides, and they'll be available for you pretty much this afternoon at some point. So welcome everyone, and at any time you've got a question or a comment or anything at all, just go to the question box there where you typed in the word clear, and I'll receive that straight away and I'll respond to it immediately. All right, so let's have a look at the topic. Let's have a look at the topics that we've covered and perhaps where we'll be covering, what we'll be doing with that. Okay. So you can see that we talked about the 5 different approaches to dealing with conflict, and you had a chance to complete a diagnostic there. We had an opportunity to pretty much understand how people like to operate. Different personalities have different ways of dealing with conflict depending on their personality type. So we looked at that in topic 2. In topic 3, we talked about controlling your emotions, and particularly the amygdala hijack, which we referred to and talked about some of the strategies around dealing with conflict. And I know that many of you got a lot out of that session, and and that's great to hear. And equally, last time we spoke 2 weeks ago, we talked about this issue of assertion. Now, assertion is a critically important concept to keep in mind when you're dealing with conflict. Being aggressive, which is at one end of the spectrum, and being passive, which is at the other end of the spectrum, either of those aren't terribly effective. So the idea, of course, is to be assertive, which we did describe as balancing the rights of the person that you're in conflict with the rights that you have, and making sure that both rights are being respected. Now, if you're doing that, there's a good chance that you're dealing fairly assertively with the situation. So today we'll talk about the some of the communication skills that are necessary, and I'll share with you a couple of things that you might find useful in that space. So we're going to talk about the listening component of dealing with conflict, and we're going to talk about the speaking component. So obviously one is listening to other people and the other one is speaking when you need to. And of course there's also the non-verbal signals that you give off, which are really important. Now, bearing in mind that conflict may not happen in a face-to-face environment, particularly during COVID-19, it can happen on the phone or in a lot of different formats, or it can even happen online. But ultimately, if you're face-to-face with someone, the most important non-verbal signal in terms of conveying assertion is actually eye contact, as you could probably imagine. So when you lower your eye contact, it can result in a lack of assertion. So good eye contact doesn't mean eyeballing, it just means making sure that you are giving the person undivided attention when they're speaking. All right, sorry, we've just got a few little things going on there. So let's get underway. Now, one of the models I want to share with you, the first model I want to share with you is the SBI model. Now, S stands for situation, B for behaviour, and I for impact. So when you're giving someone feedback, and normally in a conflict situation, you normally have to assert yourself and give some feedback, because it's quite possible that the other person has done something that has annoyed you, and so how do you express it in a way that's assertive, but at the same time is done in a way that comes across as non-aggressive? So using the SBI model is great. So what that basically means is that when you're talking to someone, the first thing you should explain is the situation that you're referring to. So it might be yesterday's meeting, or it could be a conversation you had with the person the other day. Whatever it might be, you need to anchor it back in a situation. Now, by doing that, you're not actually making generalizations. So you're referring to a particular situation. And then, of course, you've got to talk about the actual behaviours that occurred in the situation. Now, what that means, of course, is that you're not attacking the person individually, because if you attack a person individually, you're likely to escalate the conflict, and I'm sure you'd be aware of that. And we all have been guilty of doing that from time to time, and we've also, of course, been on the receiving end of that. So it's talking about the specific behaviours that you disagree with. And then the I stands for impact. So what you're doing there is you're explaining to the other person the impact that that behaviour had, not just on you, but perhaps on others and the situation in general. Now, it sounds a little bit complicated, but it's not that hard to do. And what you've got there and down the bottom right-hand corner is an example of how you might express your displeasure when you were in a meeting with someone else. So, for example, you might say, yesterday in the meeting. Now, when you say yesterday in the meeting, what you're doing is you're explaining the situation. So you're anchoring it back into a particular situation. And then you might say, when you raised your voice at me at the meeting, when I disagreed with you. Now, of course, you know, the person might dispute whether or not they raised their voice, but I think in most cases, if it was very obvious that the voice was raised, that's the behaviour that you're talking about. All right, not that they were angry, not that they were wrong. It was that they raised their voice with you when they disagreed with you. So ultimately, that's the behaviour. And then, of course, that's people at the other end might think, well, okay, what's wrong with that? You know, you were wrong and I was upset and I went ahead and did that. If you explain the impact, then the other person gets why you're raising it in the first place. So I might say, I felt embarrassed and disrespected. Now, by doing that, you're explaining the consequences of them raising their voice at you in the meeting. So you see, now you might think, well, how do I do that on the run? Because honestly, this is not something that's easy to do off the top of your head. It's not, I agree with you, but in certain situations, before you confront somebody about something, you do get a space of time where you can actually think about how you're going to express your own view. And it's extremely important you do that right, of course, because it can go off the rails very quickly. So using the SBI model, it gives you a nice little framework to work with when you're raising an issue with somebody else, and you want to raise that and you need to raise it. So that is something that I think is worth considering. So it's a great model. It works extremely well and it's easy to remember, and I think you can do that. The most underrated part of the SBI model is actually the I, because if you don't explain the impact that their behaviour had on you, then they may not understand why you're raising it with them, because they may not have the ability to put themselves in your shoes. And if that's the case, then of course they're just going to think that you're complaining for no good reason. So it's important to use the I in SBI. It's important to actually raise the impact of that behaviour or whatever it was with the other person. And by doing that, the other person, I mean, they still might not agree with you, but the bottom line is it's very hard to disagree, in this example at least, with the fact that you found it disrespectful and you were embarrassed. Now, they might not think you should be, they might not think that what they said was disrespectful, and they may not think that you should have been embarrassed about it. But the truth is that's how you felt. And I think what you're doing there is you're asserting your right to express those views to the other person. Does that make sense to everyone? It's a very great model to use, but I acknowledge that it's not something that's necessarily easy to do on the run. But certainly when you're thinking about how you're going to express a point of view at a meeting or in an individual situation so that you are actually asserting your rights to do so, the SBI model is as good as any as far as I'm concerned. So worth giving it a shot. All right, so let's move on. Here is another example. In this morning's meeting, you raised the issue about following a project we've just completed. Okay, so you've talked about the situation, and the behaviour was that you refocused our attention on something that was important for the team's performance. All right, so by doing that, you're explaining the impact of that. So that's, of course, positive feedback. And so it can be done both negatively or positively. So it's a great way of thinking about shaping the way you might give someone else some feedback. Now, one of the greatest skills that you can use, and I think it's highly underrated, and I know we've all heard about it before, but whether we do it or not may well be another thing, is the concept of paraphrasing. Now, paraphrasing is a great concept because what you do when you paraphrase somebody is that you're restating the other person's comment in your own words. You're not repeating what they said. But what you're doing is you're rephrasing. It's not necessarily summarizing. Summarizing's slightly different. But when the other person's drawn breath during a conversation with you, if you just stop and say words to the effect of, so in other words, you felt that you weren't respected when you didn't receive the information that you needed from me. Now, they may not have used those words, but ultimately what you're trying to do is to paraphrase the essence of the message that they're trying to get across to you. Now, this is enormously powerful for a couple of reasons, and I want you to practice this afternoon. So when someone's having a conversation with you this afternoon, and inevitably they will, try using the words, in other words. You'll be surprised at how incredibly effective it is. Now, it's effective for three reasons, and I'll just talk about those for a moment. When you paraphrase somebody, there's three reasons why it's a good idea. The first reason to paraphrase somebody is you could check to make sure that you have understood what they've said. So by you doing that, the other person, assuming you've got it right, of course, knows that you know. In other words, the message has landed. You've got the message. Now, it's not about you agreeing with the message at this stage or disagreeing. It's just you giving a perspective on what you heard. Now, the second reason that that's important in a conflict situation is that you're letting the manager or whoever it might be know that you understand. So by doing that, you're actually letting the other person know that you've actually listened to what they've said. You can say to someone, I'm listening, and that has some effect. But when you say to somebody, when you paraphrase somebody, then they know for sure, assuming you've got it right, of course, that you have heard what they've said. Now that's very powerful because psychologically, when you do that, what happens is that when you have something that you want to say, there is a little bit of pressure on the other person to come to the conclusion that perhaps I need to listen to what you have to say. So you can improve their capacity to listen to the message that you've got by listening to the message that they have given you. Now, there's a third important reason for paraphrasing, which is often not really communicated, but it really is important that by paraphrasing, you've actually put a full stop at the end of a sentence. In other words, what you've done is you've pretty much closed off a particular segment of the conversation, because as soon as you've done that and you get a nod or somebody agrees with what you've said or whatever, you're now in a position to take the conversation, assuming you jump in and do this, wherever you want it to go. So in other words, by paraphrasing, you are taking control of the conversation. You are doing it in a courteous way, you're doing it in an assertive way, and you're doing it in a respectful way. So paraphrasing is extremely powerful. So if you had to sit down with someone and you're having a huge argument about something, and the person is, spending 10 minutes explaining to you why something didn't happen, or why they're unhappy, or whatever it might be, as I said, don't interrupt them, but as soon as they've stopped talking, just say, so in other words, you're annoyed because you didn't receive the right information at the right time, and that caused you, not to get the report in, or whatever it might be. So by doing that, you are basically checking to make sure you've been heard. You are letting the person know that you have heard them, assuming you've got it right. And thirdly, you are actually controlling the conversation. In other words, you can then decide how you might respond once you get an affirmation that that's precisely what they were saying. So paraphrasing is very powerful. I strongly recommend that you use it. Just so summarizing in this slide here, you can see you're checking for understanding, you're showing them that you understand, and then you're taking control of the conversation. So it's very easy to do. I don't think we do this enough. We often use things like I'm listening or I understand, but how does the other person really know that you are listening? How does the other person really know that you understand? Well, the only way you can do that, of course, is to use paraphrasing. So that's a very, very important, another talking point. So a couple of reflections on paraphrasing that I'll share with you here that might be useful to have a look at. Repeating what you, just get that out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. Repeating what you have just heard in your own words without parroting, so the insurance company isn't going to accept your claim because the accident happened on your way home from work. By doing that, it's not, you're not repeating it, but you're really summarizing it, as I said, in your own words, although I probably wouldn't use the word summary. All right, I think I've got a question here. Oh, okay, you just lost connection. We'll watch the recording later. Okay, thanks, Elsie. Well, you're probably gone now, but I understand. Thank you. So secondly, what you can do in the paraphrasing situation is that you're reflecting the feelings. So you can focus, what you should be trying to do is to focus on the feelings words that are being expressed. So if someone says, I'm annoyed, then the paraphrasing should be around the word annoyed. Or I feel disrespected, then the paraphrasing must be around the word disrespected. So in other words, what words do you latch on to in someone's monologue? So they might have spent 10 minutes saying something, you think, well, how do I paraphrase that? Well, what were the feeling words that came out? And then you can restate that feeling. It sounds like the hall damage during the exam week has made you feel stressed, look, whatever it might be. So in this case, the feeling would be the feeling of stress. So you try very hard to look for the feeling words in what people say and share it with them. And bear in mind, it's not just to let the person know that you've heard them and all the rest of it. It's also so you can gain control of the conversation. You may feel overwhelmed, but by doing this, you've got some control. You've got some dialogue happening rather than them just talking non-stop for 10 minutes. You can interrupt them, not interrupt them as in, jumping in, but you can take an opportunity when they draw breath to use that. So it's a very, very effective tool. Now, listening, of course, is critically important. We all talk about this on a regular basis, and sometimes when you're stressed and you're in a conflict situation, our listening goes out the window. In other words, we might feel that we're being attacked or something, or we've stopped actually listening. But listening is a process of taking in what you've heard and mentally organising it in some sense of information. So you've got to try to, as much as you can, to remain calm when you're in those conflict situations. And we've talked a little bit about this in Unit 3. So they also assist you to decode the non-verbal as well. So you should be watching for the facial expressions and how they're communicating what they're saying, not just the words that they're saying. So listening is not just the words, it's also the non-verbal cues that you're picking up. And sometimes those non-verbal cues are not that easy to decipher, true enough. But listen, so become a better listener. Now, listening is not an easy topic because and it's true to say, and just to give you a few statistics on this, 70 to 80% of your day is actually engaged in some form of communication. Okay, that probably won't surprise you. But about 55% of that time is devoted to listening. All right, so here's where the problem is. Your brain can process approximately 450 words a minute. So while I'm talking to you now, you're probably off thinking about what you're going to have for lunch, or maybe you're having lunch and you're wondering, maybe you're tinkering with your iPhone, I don't know. But because our brain is working a lot faster than I can speak, and I can speak at around, as most people do, around 125 to 175 words per minute. So you can see the problem. If I'm speaking at 125 to 175 words a minute, and you can process 450 words a minute, there's a gap, and you get bored, and you start wondering, your mind starts wandering. So this is the reason why listening is so difficult. Ultimately, this is the real reason. It's not that I'm not saying anything interesting, or it could be that as well, but ultimately that's what happens. So our brain wanders off in another direction as a result of that, and that will often be the case. So you might be surprised to learn that your words only convey about 7% of what you're trying to say. Now, I think it might be a bit higher than that, but that's certainly what the studies show. The other 93% of the communication is through facial gestures and tone of voice. We pick up these things very quickly, and particularly when we're on the telephone, because when we're on the telephone, of course, we can't see the person. So we pick up the tone, and we can't pick up the facial expression. So tone becomes even more critical in that. You know yourself, when you're listening to someone on the end of the phone, you can pick up their tone very quickly, and you will jump to conclusions about how they're feeling based on the tone. So there are many, many different types of listening. There's pseudo listening, which many of us engage in, where we're pretending to listen, but our eyes are glazed over and we're wandering off thinking about something else. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the other person probably knows you're not listening to them, just as you know that the other person's not listening to you, because we can pick up pseudo listening pretty quickly. So we're not very good at faking listening, but it's pretty much fake listening. Appreciative listening is where you're truly trying to understand what the other person's on about, and that's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. Empathetic listening is similar to that, where you're trying to understand and put yourself in their shoes. Comprehensive listening is where you're trying to draw out of what they're saying the key facts and the key information in order to make a decision or how you might react. And critical listening is listening carefully, as you might be with me now, around, is this guy making sense? Is this coherent? Is this all consistent with what he said earlier on in the Lunch and Learn series? So there's a very wide range of different types of listening. But the important thing is to take a deep breath to prevent the amygdala hijack that we talked about in Unit 3, and really trying to listen to the other person and what they're saying. And there's a lot of good reasons for doing that. But if you tune out and don't listen to the other person, obviously they're not going to be too interested in listening to you, because they're picking up their cues from you that you're not really listening to them. You're pseudo listening. Now, if you do that, why should they spend time and energy trying to listen to you when you're not listening to them? So one of the key skills, I think, in communication, in conflict or any situation, is to really, really listen, and really spend the time to do that and devote your 100% attention to do that. That is an underrated skill. I can give you all the smart phrases and I am, I guess, all the things you can say to the other person, but quite honestly, if you're not listening to what they're going to say, what they're saying, then you really aren't going to be very effective in a conflict situation. All right. Now, in the process of listening, there are a number of things that we can do. And this is an acronym here that you can use, but hearing is the actual auditory aspect of it. So obviously, if people are speaking in a soft voice, it's hard to hear people, but clearly there's a physiological aspect to it. There's an understanding aspect to it, where you're putting aside your own biases and prejudices and trying to actually understand where the other person's coming from. Easier said than done, obviously. Remembering, of course, is that short-term and long-term memory, so that you can sort of, store away things that have been said in a previous conversation or whatever. So remembering and recall is part of listening. There's also a decoding of non-verbal signals, that is interpreting. So when someone's angry, you don't really need to hear that they're angry. It'll be very obvious by their demeanor. They might have a red face, or they might be even shouting at you, and it's fairly obvious, and they might be eyeballing all sorts of things. So it's not hard to pick up those things. And then, of course, another thing you're doing while you're listening to people is you're evaluating. You're trying to evaluate and decipher the message that they're trying to send you. And then, of course, there's the responding. That's choosing an appropriate response. And that's where I think the SBI model is very good. That's where I think paraphrasing works extremely well for you. So, folks, are there any questions that people have got at this stage? Anything you'd like to ask me, or anything at all? Just go to the question box on the right-hand side and just type in your question or your comment. I'd really appreciate hearing what you've got to say about this topic. So I look at, while people are collecting their thoughts about this, it's really important to start to work very hard on some of these skills. The good news for you and me is that we can find opportunities every single day to paraphrase. We can find opportunities every single day to practice our listening. So it's not as if we don't have the opportunities to do that. It's whether we take those opportunities up and start to work hard at it. Now, I'm a professional listener because I do a lot of coaching, executive coaching and other types of coaching. And frankly, as a coach, one of my tools is often to listen. I have to listen because I need to know where the other person's coming from. Because if I don't know where the other person's coming from, I'm going to be in a bit of strife. Yeah, we've just got somebody saying, very interesting so far, listening is often my weakness. Well, my comment is, don't make it a strength. Make it a strength. Really give the person undivided attention. Use active listening. Use the skills that you've learned, and just get good at it. Because if you don't think you're a good listener, then I can assure you the other person probably doesn't think you're a good listener either. And if they don't think you're a good listener, they may feel compelled to raise their voice, because they think by raising their voice it might sink in. Not necessarily the case, as we know. So concentrate on becoming a good listener. can make a huge difference in terms of being able to deal with conflict in the workplace or anywhere for that matter. And sometimes we just don't feel like listening. I understand that, or we might have heard the same story over and over again. And here we go again, and you just sort of tune out and use pseudo listening when in actual fact, and the other person knows that, so they just keep rambling on. Have you noticed that people keep rambling on? You've heard the story before. They keep rambling on because they don't think it's sunk in, because they can see that you're not listening. So if you want people to stop rambling, it's a good idea to listen carefully to what they say and reflect back to them what you've heard by using this, in other words, concept that I've talked about. Okay, so I guess my point is, and as somebody just pointed out there, in there, that they see this as a weakness, my point is that listening is hard work. It's not easy. And it's certainly not hearing. It's actually listening is a much more interactive process than that. So this would be an incredibly important skill to learn in the whole notion of dealing with conflict. So good listeners, I think, have, and this might help with the comment that you made there about it being a weakness, good listeners will exhibit these traits. And for you to just run your eyes down this list and think, am I doing these things? So a good listener is someone that's patient. In other words, they don't just jump in at the moment, at the moment as soon as they get an opportunity, unless they're paraphrasing. But even then, it's spending time hearing the person, letting them express themselves. So to do that, of course, you've got to be patient. You've also got to be able to ask the right questions, and I really encourage you to use questions like why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. If you ask a question that starts with why, what, where, who, how, and which, 5 W's and an H, then what you're doing is you're drawing out of the other person more information that will allow you to understand what they're saying. So why did you say that? When did it take place? Who was involved? How did it occur? All of these sorts of questions give the other person the opportunity to explain themselves far better. Now, a good thing, a very good question to ask, which is a closed question, those questions that of course are open, a good question to ask people is, just so I understand this a little bit more, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? That's a really great question because they're not going to say no, really. So what that means is it gives you a little license to jump in and ask some questions, which will be open-ended questions, which will give an opportunity for that person to elaborate on their point of view. So recognizing and separating and evaluating fact from inference. So yes, this is a bit of a skill, but people, when they're upset and they're in a conflict situation, are often expressing emotion rather than logic. And so separating the logic from the emotion in the conversation is really important. So yes, I know they're upset because I can see it on their face, but why are they upset? And that's, of course, the logical part where you might want to ask questions. And of course, a good listener is somebody who can think critically. So they're thinking critically. They're critically absorbing the information that they're receiving. And of course, they're recognizing patterns. And so, if you hear something early in a conversation, you can park it mentally and then come back to it later by saying something along the lines of, look, you just said earlier that was a problem. All right, so they've said that about 10 minutes ago, but you've remembered them saying that. And by bringing it up again, you're paraphrasing them, you're showing them that you're listening, but you're also connecting the dots between what they said then and perhaps what they're saying now. You're looking for those patterns. You're looking to cluster information into groups, and so forth. Now, in order to do all these things, you've got to give the person 100% attention. You can't be looking out the window or thinking about what you're going to have for dinner, or all of those things cannot happen for you to be able to do all these things. Of course, reflecting is important, and that will often happen after the conversation, where you think a little bit more about the conversation, but you reflect constructively. You think to yourself, I wonder why they really got upset about that, assuming you don't know. And of course, as I said before, paraphrasing is part of a good a listener's repertoire. And demonstrating empathy and positive regard, trying to be as positive as you can. And of course, it's not always easy to do, but ultimately, if you've got the right intent in the conversation, the conflict is likely to be resolved in a far more effective way. So these are some of the skill sets, and you might like to consider, well, which of those am I doing and which of those am I not doing? Okay, jump in at any time, folks, if you've got questions. Now, attending skills is a slightly different skill set to listening. So let me explain what I mean by attending skills, if I may. So if you have a look at the list there, and I'm just going to take, I think we've got a question here. No, okay. All right. So let's have a look at this list. Okay, so we've got attending skills are culturally sensitive. Now, what that means, of course, is that, you know, different cultures have different perspectives on this. Now, I don't want you to get yourself into a knot about this culture. A lot of people, you know, you can get so caught up in generalizations about cultures that sometimes you forget what you're doing. And I think all cultures, there are a number of things that transcend all cultures. And one of those is respect, fundamental, decent respect. So be aware that, though, that certain cultures have certain ways of doing things. Some cultures, people are a bit more forward. Other cultures, they're a little bit more reticent. Other cultures, they're, you know, they tend to see a manager as, you know, they're always right, and there's a whole lot of other things that are interesting in that. But regardless of culture, I think what you need to do is to think about some of these things. Posture. So leaning forward denotes an interest. Okay, so if you're sitting down with someone, not necessarily, you know, leaning too far forward, but just leaning slightly forward would indicate that you're showing respect and you're listening to what the other person's got. Just be aware that when you fold your arms and this kind of thing, what you're basically saying to the other person is that, you know, I'm blocking off what you're saying, basically. I don't agree with it, and I'm frankly not interested. So try and keep an open gestures if possible, and calmly, you know, and of course appropriate distance as well, of course. That's not hard in COVID-19 times, that's for sure. Appropriate body motion. Of course, you don't want to be, you know, doodling while you're talking to someone on a piece of paper. That's annoying. Maybe not annoying to you. Someone said to me the other day, oh, I doodle because it helps me think. That's fine, but what message does it send to the person that you're listening to? It sends a message that, frankly, I'm not too interested in what you've got to say. So give the person 100% attention, and don't, you know, try to, you know, don't have too many annoying gestures, if you like. I guess that's the point. So look, the most important one out of all of these is eye contact. Eye contact is extremely important because it does a number of things. So practice your eye contact. It might seem like a very strange thing I'm asking you to do, but ultimately it's funny that we've never really been taught how to have good eye contact. So a lot of people, you might be surprised to know, have a lot of trouble making good eye contact. Either they're very shy, or they perceive eyeballing as eye contact. Now, you know what it's like when someone eyeballs you. It's not very pleasant. Eyeballing means that I'm blazing into your eyes and I'm not diverting from that gaze. And that can be very intimidating for the other person. By the same token, if I'm looking over the shoulder while I'm talking to you like this, then it's clear that there's obviously something here that's more important than what you've got to say. So usually good eye contact is eye to eye, little triangle on the forehead, eye to eye, up to the forehead, up to here and down. That's the best way to make good eye contact. And that way you're not eyeballing, but at the same time you're not staring over their shoulder. So practice that, because if there's anything that's more important in attending skills, I would say there's nothing more important than actually having appropriate eye contact. And of course, non-distractive environment. You don't want noise and people walking in and out. So find a space where you can have these conversations with people where you won't actually be interrupted is really important. So a few things to think about there. All right, now I've got some homework for you. We're just finishing a bit early, but if anyone's got any questions, of course, I'm keen to hear them. Now, I didn't want to overload you in this session with too much stuff, because at the end of the day, when you're in the heat of the battle in conflict, obviously there's a lot to think about. And I don't want to make it one of these things that is so difficult that you just turn away from it. But I've shared with you a couple of the really important things to do when you're communicating in a conflict situation. And you can imagine that the homework will be about practicing these things. And the good news for you is you can start practicing this right now. That is this afternoon, straight after lunch. You can go off and you can try these skills, and I want you to try these skills. If you want to become good at dealing with conflict, which I know you do, you wouldn't be investing the time and energy in this Lunch and Learn series unless you did. Then you must practice the skills that we're talking about. And I've shared with you a lot of things. So it could be one thing today. You could go away and just learn to paraphrase a bit better, or you could learn to maintain good steady eye contact. All right, or you could learn to improve your listening skills, whatever it might be. So we want you to practice that and start to work at it. And many of you have kindly shared with me via email, your progress in these areas, and it's wonderful to read. So I'd encourage you can send me an email. Let me know how you're going with some of these, some of the challenges that you're facing in terms of dealing with conflict. So folks, are there any questions at this stage before we wrap up? Anything at all? Okay, all right. So you get an opportunity to have a look at the learning platform, and there's a few little things to do on there, which I think you'll find very useful. And just keep working at these things. Don't be hard on yourself. Just chip away, moment by moment, situation by situation. And when you do get a win, in other words, when you've done one of these things successfully, I want you to be positive with yourself about it. I want you to actually give yourself good feedback, because we're our worst enemy sometimes. So, just let yourself know that you're happy with how you handle that situation, regardless of what happened at the end of it. So one thing is, of course, to resolve the conflict, but another thing is to manage and handle yourself within the conflict, and that's the part that I want you to work on. All right, so we're done, folks. So thank you, everyone. We've just got a comment here before we finish up. I have problems with the learning platform login. Has anyone else had problems, says Sam. Does anyone else have problems? Sam, I can check that out for you. If you just shoot me an email at the end of this, I'll go in and check it for you, because sometimes it can be an issue. Thank you, no worries. But is anyone else having problems getting into the learning platform? No, so it's email address, and then the password is welcome with a capital W, welcome 20, no space between welcome and 20. Now I'll be sending out an email this afternoon just reminding you of that, so you'll get that again. But Sam, more than happy to check it all out for you. So I'll wait for your email. All right, thanks folks, we're done. So happy communication and keep working on those things. And we'll catch up again in a fortnight. And the topic that we'll be looking at then, of course, is giving and receiving constructive feedback, which is one of the things that I find most people find very challenging. So I thought I'd give it a whole session. All right, so thanks everyone. All the best. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And we look forward to seeing you. Oh, great. That's good, Elsie. Sorry, it's probably, I don't know whether I've got your name pronounced correctly, but anyway, I'm glad you could come back in. Yeah, look, that's the trouble with all this online stuff. We're at the mercy of the internet, aren't we? Never mind, but I'm pleased to hear you coming back. So thank you. Look forward to seeing you, everybody, in a fortnight. Thank you, and all the best. And have a great rest of the day, and practice your communication skills this afternoon. Thank you and goodbye.